welcome to the BioCharisma podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Gardner. Today we have Mike Wilkerson of Stellium 7. We did an interview in my first season of the BioCharisma podcast, and Mike is the preeminent titanologist in the world. He's a wonderful man that's pretty much, I think, proving the whole notion of biogeology. I think biogeology is a very incredible topic to discuss because lately in a lot of my live streams and other interviews, we've been talking about atmospheric conditions. And I kind of wanted to tie the two together. I wanted to tie our geology, which is like the earth that we walk on, relative to the sky that's above us, the fluid that's above us that we call the sky. And Mike has enough knowledge when it comes to instant petrification and biology to be able to understand a few theories that I wanted to posit with him, that the genesis of those theories were coming from my discussions with Jim Lee about certain technologies that are in use with how the weather is managed, let's say, weather management. So this particular talk, it might sound like we're touching on a lot of different points, but they all do get tied together into a very, all gets set up in with a nice pretty bow about how the geology that might have one time been the biology of very large creatures and large, fauna and foliage, how we're actually on top of that and how that would explain a lot of the indicators that are within our atmosphere. So enjoy, take a lot of notes, and check out Stellium 7 on YouTube. It's a great, it's an absolute wonderful channel on YouTube. I really enjoyed pretty much all of Mike's offerings. I think he said that, I'm trying to remember, he states which actual videos to watch relative to this conversation in the actual body of our interview. So enjoy this, and I will see you on. Ooh, what was that?
That was my phone getting put in flight mode.
Oh, good. Good. Turn. Reminder, we are set. Mr. Mike Wilkerson of 7. How you doing, my friend? Good to have you back in the BioCharisma podcast.
Nice to be back. Thanks for the invite, Topher.
Yeah, Mike, I wanted to talk to you about a few things. I had a bunch of different, they appear to be different lines of query that kind of lead back to you, biogeology. And I guess one thing I have to get better at in my podcast is actually introducing the people I'm talking to and like what their specialty is at. So before we get into where my interest is in talking with you, could you please describe to people your notion of biogeology and just like a brief summary of how you actually got to coming up with this term and what some of the implications of it are, like when we re-examine the world through those eyes?
Sure. Well, it started about 10 years ago, kind of went through a major awakening to a lot of different conspiracy threads, and one of them being the Earth shape itself, and was challenged by a friend of mine to look into that. And I thought he was crazy. Alex Michael,
Right. Yes.
conspiracy music guru.
Yeah.
And so as I tried to shut him down with evidence, I found that the evidence was flimsy the more the more I provided. And so that just got me examining the nature of reality with new and open eyes, and questioning a bit of everything. And one of the threads that came along not long after that was just the idea that geology might not be what we were taught, and that things like petrification could happen far, far quicker than we were told. And that was an astonishing idea for me, because I'd seen lots of different examples of rock and different formations that never made sense to me based on the basics of what I knew about geology and petrogenesis, which is the origin of stone and how those things come about. And they looked a lot like biology to me, oftentimes. And
Right.
I work as a chiropractor, and I studied a lot of biology and anatomy and histology, and the correlations are just astonishing. When you really look at it with new eyes, there's so many things that we're told about how stone forms and how long it takes that cause you to just kind of cast aside the basics of what you're looking at in favor of it must be something other than what it appears to be. And so that was really how it began for me. I was turned on to the work of Roger Spurr with Mud Fossil University. There was another channel at the time called Flat Earth Nation. He was talking about nephorensics. Roger Spurr was talking about mud fossils, and he was the one I initially, got this idea from, that the permineralization process, which is petrification, like when we look at petrified tree, that's what we're told is happening, is that there's this substitution of the elements that were in the mud that surrounded the tree, that have worked their way in, and the gas and the liquid in the tree, or in the different fleshy things that might have petrified, have worked their way out. And that, according to him, could happen very quickly. And he was making the claim that all stone was actually biology. And in a sense, that's what the mainstream geological narrative tells us also, but they're telling us that it's from dead plant life and animal life that is laid down and been compressed over hundreds of millions of years, and first into sedimentary layers, and then as the pressure gets great enough, into what's known as metamorphic rock, which is like your marble and your granite and these different really hard stones that have all the swirling biological look to them. But he was also presenting ideas about titanic creatures as well. And I love the mythology of these subjects, and never really gave it much credence that it might be based in some kind of a truth about a distant past where the world was far different than what we were led to believe in our Rockefeller produced textbooks. So and the penny dropped for me after seeing some of his videos, a video by Wakey Wakey, where he was examining some of the cornerstones of geology and showing that things like dating techniques are questionable, and a lot of the stuff that's just claimed as fact doesn't actually have scientific study behind it. And the scientific method has always been very important to me, and that it's applied correctly. So yeah, and then here in the town that I live in Spain, there's a mountain that appears to look like a big elephant laying down. It's about 3 miles long and 1 mile tall, and it's not something that I ever considered for a second was once a creature. I just thought, oh, how cute that it looks that way, and so after getting exposed to these ideas, I started to look at it with new eyes, and got on Google Earth and found a lot of different anatomical correlations that were beyond just like it looks that way from one particular angle. And within a couple hours of examining it, I had already a laundry list of of different anatomical features. So that's kind of how the whole thing began. And then there's been a whole lot of other chapters and synchronicities along the way.
That's a wonderful, quick summary of what you've been doing. And part of the reason why I was drawn to you is scale. I love thinking about scale, and I think we discussed that a bunch in our first conversation. To think that there were these titans, there were these demigod-like massive beings, kind of gives like a whole different understanding to the giant trees that I think are pretty obvious. The Birkeland current, I guess you would say pathways that we see, whether those Birkeland current pathways are in the ground as, like little veins of coal, whether they're what form are riverbeds. When you make the scale that big, then it makes what our current geology and geography looks like. It makes it make sense. And then in a very weird way, that scale also gives a lot of credence to the Yuga cycle. Because when I used to read, when I did read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and the Puranas, they talk about these different epochs that we live in, these different ages that we live in, and they talk a lot about the scale and what people in certain ages, what beings in certain ages can do relative to what beings in other ages could do. And it always rang true with me, but it wasn't until your biogeology, because I had come across the mud fossil stuff before I came across your site, but you had such a well-rounded way of actually describing it and like going into your own personal experience and like, showing the the elephant and your hikes and everything like that. I mean, it was just awesome. And then plus, you also showing the anatomy of the heart. I've been studying. My mom was in cardiopulmonary practice for 45 years, so that's always been in the forefront of my consciousness that the heart isn't a pump and blah 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 blah. We don't have to go down that route. But seeing all these hearts, my ex-wife, she used to like literally everywhere we go, she would collect heart stones. Like that was her thing. And it was like, oh, there's the Venus cava, there's this, there's that. It's like so obvious. But you were the first person to like really, at least in my consciousness, talk about it in such a articulate way. It really drove the point home. Because in my mind's eye, I was conditioned that petrification was, like you said, a very slow process. Even though, like going out to Arizona into the petrified forest, it's like these trees obviously were not petrified over a very long period of time. They were like petrified instantly by something. And I should have like, extrapolated from that at some point. So what I'm thinking of now in revisiting your work and the implications of biogeology is that pretty much all of our natural resources that we use, especially in masonry or the resources in heavyweight construction, probably at some point were an animal or some massive being at some point. And I just kind of want to see if you and I are on the same page with that before I jump into some of my latest, musings around that subject.
Yeah, definitely. The mainstream geological model would also agree with you, but they would talk about it in, these eons that are
Right.
millions of years long. And they're saying that except for the volcanic stone, igneous rock, that we can see spewing out of volcanoes, that basically every other kind of stone that we encounter here was originally one form of plant life or animal life, or many squished together. But that's different from a more direct, the stones that we see might have very recently been something that was alive. And scale is a factor, obviously, that it could be something small like a mouse all the way up to titanic trees or perhaps titanic beings.
So with these titanic beings and with instant petrification, we have to talk about how instant petrification can actually occur. Um, I've been subject to seeing very, very high arc plasma ground fault situations with lightning and ball lightning and all the rest of it. I would like you to kind of, inform people how instant petrification could actually occur, especially when we think of gigantic scale. Because right now we measure things in the scale that we're in. And even right now, a lightning bolt's of a lot of electricity. But let's say there were these titanic creatures and there were like giant humans and giant trees. Think of the scale of that type of plasma discharge or lightning. Like, let's kind of inform people what that would actually look like.
Yeah, well, I pretty early on abandoned mud fossil theory as an explanation for what I was finding with the mountain, and especially what I was finding with the heartstones. The mountain, because it made no sense to me that something that was at 753 meters would have been covered in mud for who knows how long and then petrified into stone. And then where would all that mud have gone? So that would have meant that the whole, ground level would have had to have been much higher for a very, very long time while this dead creature just became stone. So that didn't make sense to me. And I suspected that there was probably some kind of an instantaneous or very, very quick event that would cause something like that to happen.
Mhm.
And when we look around the world, we see examples of scarring all over the earth in the form of Lichtenberg figures, which are these fractal-like, we're told that it's formed by
Mhm.
rivers that are carving this, but it doesn't really make sense when you start to analyze like how something like the Grand Canyon could have been carved by the Colorado River. Makes a lot more sense when you look at it from above and you see how plasma affects things. And an example of
Mhm.
that is like you can put electrodes at either end of a piece of wood and burn this fractal pattern in the wood. And the more power you're using, the deeper the grooves and the more pronounced. And then eventually, if you start at opposite ends, they'll meet. And then it's like, it's a huge thing. So the Grand Canyon would be the biggest example of something like that on the Earth, but they're all over. And so initially I was thinking something like volcanic activity because you've got ash, you've got high mineral content waters mixing together. That's already enough to cause petrification, but not necessarily instant petrification. Heat as well. Volcanoes with their
Mhm.
pyroclastic flows got an explosion that is going to, you know, the the mainstream geological narrative tells us that pyroclastic flows can travel at the speed of sound and reach temperatures of 1500 degrees Celsius. That's a very powerful thing that in my mind would be capable of turning things to stone, annihilating them. But that gets into my theories about why I was finding heart stones outside of the body, is that there's something that's actually destroying the outer portion of the body while the organs themselves are hardening. And there are different examples that we can talk about with that have to do with things like bog bodies and my theories, which I call boiled egg theory. But we can come back to that. Going back to the Lichtenberg figures, lightning strikes. We're talking about plasma, and there's an example in a video by the Thunderbolts Project, Mungo Jup, called, I think it was instant petrification or something like that. And he's described an event that occurred somewhere in Canada. And I've tried to track down more information on this and haven't been able to find it. But basically, there was a high tension wire that went down and it laid over a bunch of tree stumps, and the current continued for hours. And then when they finally, turned off the current and they were able to kind of deal with this scenario, what they found is that the tree stumps had petrified, and this is in like a matter of 6 hours. And not only had the stumps petrified, but the entire root structures had petrified. So just really, really high current going through biological material seems to be, enough. You mentioned the Birkeland currents, and I'm guessing that's like I'm not familiar with that term, but is that where basically the different elements that are in something as a result of getting hit are going to align themselves on these along these fractal lines and kind of accumulate based on the element? Is that what that is?
I think I said the wrong word. You said the correct word. I said Birkeland, the term that you used for the electrical arcing through
Okay,
organic.
okay. The Lichtenberg figures.
Yeah, I just said the
Yeah,
wrong
okay.
thing.
Yeah, so like there's examples if you search for Lichtenberg, Lichtenberg on an image search, one of the things you'll find is sand where lightning has struck beaches and it's created these fractal patterns of sand that have reached up and are hardened. And they're
Mm-hmm.
they're interesting to look at. They're also diamond tubules that form as well when there's these high power events. And as far as
Mm-hmm.
plasma goes, there's simple examples. I mentioned last time we spoke of a man who does an experiment where he's mixing different powders together, and he puts a little bit of steel wool so the current can move freely, and he puts it in a votive, which is basically a crucible with a ceramic lid on top, puts it in in a microwave, and within 10 seconds he's transmuting these powders into ruby. So that
Right.
that takes us in all kinds of different directions, just that one subject alone. Um, but I suspect that a lot of the petrification that we see, like you alluded to with the petrified trees, is probably happening instantaneously or at least very rapidly. And
Mm-hmm.
also there, I mentioned before, Ben, the archivist, his channel, he's covered lots of newspaper articles from the turn of the century, 1880s to 1920s, roughly. And they're examples of them harvesting these petrified forests that are no longer there, that were, the trees were filled with copper and silver and gold in
Mm-hmm.
large quantities. So they were assaying huge amounts of silver to the ton, just by harvesting these trees. So were these trees that were growing silver and gold? I don't think so. They might have been monatomic and flowing through the sap, the blood of the tree. And then when they got hit, all of those monatomics align themselves along the lines of the current. And that's why we're
Mm-hmm.
finding silver veins and gold veins and copper veins and that sort of thing. And where are they finding those things? They're finding them in quartz seams, which that lines up perfectly with the work of Hangman 1128, showing, in my mind, unequivocally that the great trees were real and that the quartz seams were the sap. And you can see all of the different elements of the periodic table are being created in one way or another by the trees. Either the trees grew those elements or those elements were created in some kind of a transmutation process when the trees got hit.
It makes so much sense to me. So the cosmology that I'm in currently would have me believe that we're in the Iron Age. We're in the Kali Yuga. And the Kali Yuga is demarcated by, it's the smallest of all the scales. It's pretty much when consciousness is at its most dense form. And of course, it's not everybody and blah, blah, blah. A lot of people end up getting like, a little bit insulted when you say that they might be living in the not the most exalted age per se, right? Um, but in this Kali Yuga, because the scale is smaller, we're getting like a smaller version of everything. And so I'm out digging, like I'm a builder by day. That's my day job. And we're digging foundations for things. So we get, at least 3 or 4 feet down in the ground. Most of the time when we're digging, we're at least, 6 to 8 feet down in the ground. And I'm always coming across, like when you look at the cross section of the ground, you'll see these seams, right? And you'll see that it kind of rolls with the land. So if you have this gentle slope of the land doing this, you'll see a seam kind of follow whatever the top is doing, if it hadn't been, already modified one way or another. And what I'm seeing more and more often is, number one, it's very obvious that there isn't quite like any real organic land left, meaning like every part of this world has been treaded upon a bunch and has been modified a bunch. That's what I'm getting, because we find stuff that like way down in the ground that you'd be like, wait a minute, how is this even possible that this is here, given the timeline or the history that we're told about. But another thing is that you see these, like they're like these organic, the best way I could say it is the flow forms that you see. I should say it this way: the flow forms that I see don't match the sedimentation models that I was given at all. And
Yeah.
the scale of what you're talking about is like, okay, in this area of the United States, this it was true, it was a savanna, right? Just to the east of the river were the big forests. So imagine in other ages, imagine during the Kali Yuga, or excuse me, the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, or the Tetra Yuga, the Silver Age, that you had a bigger scale, and like one of these trees that was like, let's say a few miles tall falls over, and now my entire area is full of quartz. Like we can't, my daughter just for fun will walk out into the yard and pick up hundreds of quartz crystals. They're everywhere. And that
It's
makes so much more sense to me that there were these massive, massive things that had grown when their life cycle, for whatever reason, ended. They end up on their side, and then you're just inundated with areas that have like the gold or the silver or the quartz or whatever. That makes a lot more sense to me than these aggregating weather patterns and flow patterns, aggregating all this stuff to be found in some future date. That doesn't make that much sense.
Yeah, and when you look at the flow forms you're talking about, they have this alternating color usually,
Yes.
where it's like one color then another and then another and then another, and they're different thicknesses as well. So you couldn't explain it just from like a seasonal change. Well, maybe you could
Right.
if you're thinking of tree rings and growth rings, right? And
Right.
so the mainstream model is that everything died and then laid down and then compressed, and then tectonic activity has broken it upward, and that has exposed these layers. And like when you're driving on highways that where you go through the parts of the road that have been cut through, and you look to the side, usually they look like that because they've probably gone through what was once a portion of one of the great trees. And if you see it through the great tree perspective, all of those different shapes and forms make perfect sense. But when you just think of it as stuff laying down, it's like it's totally baffling, especially when you see concentric circles that look like knots. Like how does things, falling down and layering like that, how does that lead to something that has, the appearance of tree grain or knots? It doesn't make sense.
No, not at all. So I think there's a great organizing principle in our geology that your biogeology points to. And the organizing principle is life begets life. So you have these living animals, these living plants that were massive in scale. Like just it makes the dinosaur stuff. I think at some point we had to be fed dinosaurs just because any of us that had any wherewithal or any fascination with scale would have been fascinated by the grandiosity of the size of these animals. It's like one of these tidbits, like you kind of feed a child to like let their curiosity run, but you're running them down to like a dead end. That curiosity can be satiated in something that doesn't actually exist. I think a big part of the space story is that because we have this natural part of us that wants to explore. And so you feed the space story and say, hey, the world is like, there's nothing left to explore in the world. It's out there. And then builds that model. So we have these massive animals that were much, much, much bigger. Like when we're talking about trees that are miles high, we're talking about elephants that are 3 miles long by a mile tall after the moisture of the being is left. You know, who's to say what it was before that? Because I pyrolyze a lot of stuff, and so the second the moisture goes out of the whatever you pyrolyze, it usually shrinks a bunch. So these things go ahead and shrink, but they're massive. They're absolutely titanic, just as their names imply. These beings are, because they're living, are organizing everything. We know that our gut biome, right? And at our scale, our gut biome is pretty much the alchemists that are always working in converting what we're bringing into our body into what our body needs. When those little alchemists are doing what they need, we're healthy. We're crushing. When we poison those alchemists any way that we can, those alchemists can't convert the raw materials we're giving them into what we need. And then, life kind of, the health takes a little kick in the pants. Could you imagine what the gut biome was of that elephant where you live in Spain? Could you
Yeah, well, I think they say that we have more bacteria in our gut than we have cells in our body. So, and there's such a variety of things. And then if you throw in the concept of pleomorphism, that the body appears to be creating things that are needed to deal with whatever's happening, that makes it just that much more complex. Um,
ah,
yeah, it's, when I'm thinking about the big trees, the gigantism in the mainstream narrative is accepted as well. They give us the dinosaurs, and they talk about that the insects were huge back, when the dinosaurs were alive. Everything was bigger, but it can only reach a
mhm,
certain size because of the square cube law, which has to do with the mainstream notion of gravity. And the basic idea is this: if you have a sphere that's, say, this big, and you double the size of the sphere, you've increased the volume of the sphere by 8 times. And I was on Chat GPT
yes,
the other day, and I was like wondering, like, okay, well, if you double the diameter, because I was thinking about Earth shape, if you double the diameter, how much are you going to be increasing the gravitational pull, right? Because
uh-huh,
one of the things that they tell us is that these things couldn't have existed because as you double the size of them, you're increasing the volume so much that their mass would be so great that they would collapse under their own weight, and their bones wouldn't be able to support them. And obviously, those ideas go out the window if you start to realize that, well, the electrostatic force is something like one with 30 zeros behind it, stronger than the supposed strong force of gravity. But
right.
so this whole square cube law, I think, is just there. Well, it is a law, and it's like the same thing with the inverse square law of light. These are things that are measurable. But when you double the diameter of a sphere, or say the Earth, you're going to double the gravitational pull as well. So the whole idea of we see too far, we're observing things that are way beyond where we should be able to because they should be obscured behind a curve. Well, then a lot of people will, when you're talking to them about the subject, they'll default to, well, it must just be a lot bigger than maybe we realize. And that doesn't really work, because if it's a lot bigger than we were told, then all of their calculations for gravitational pull and trajectories and landing rovers on Mars and on asteroids and all that stuff, all that goes out the window because those
Right.
calculations don't function anymore. So that was an interesting thing to realize along the way, is that if gravity isn't what we were taught, then there's absolutely nothing to say that things couldn't have gotten to grown a titanic size. And I think I agree with you. I think we're downsizing, and we're maybe like spiraling into the vortex, like you said in our last conversation,
Yes.
where everything seems to be getting smaller, and the remnants of all the big stuff are still here if you have the eyes to see it.
Yeah. I even look at a lot of old architecture. I mean, some of these, depending on who you ask, who built a lot of these structures, that have these massive doorways, window sills that are like 20, 30 feet up in the air, like all this stuff on our scale makes no sense. Like it just doesn't make sense. Like why is a 6 foot man gonna make a door where he can't even reach the door handle? Like that doesn't make sense. Um, so I do think in different ages there was a different scale, and I think every age isn't so cut and dry. I think you always will have a remnant from the age before that will survive a while when there is an age shift, and it's talked about that in the Upanishads. Like that is a thing where you'll have bygones of a past era kind of muddy around a little bit, and then their time is done. Um, so this is what I wanted to talk to you about in now that we have like we've kind of given a context for the larger scale of things and a broad idea of what the geology and therefore the atmospheric conditions would be like in a bygone era in a different age. Let's just say everything was much, much larger. So does that sound like a good starting point to go from
Yeah.
as I get
Let,
into
let me
the
just let me just add one thing on that note before you go in a new direction. So if you think about the Titanic trees, and I got the chance to travel with Mike Hangman 1128 in South Dakota since we spoke last. I was there in July
wonderful.
and got to see the Black Hills, and he took me to. He's been going there for years, and so he couldn't have,
Mhm.
I couldn't have had a better tour guide because he knows where all of the best sites are. So I got to see stuff that was just absolutely, gobsmacking. And
Mhm.
so it's very clear once you're there and you have the eyes to see it, what you're looking at. It's tree in all of its forms, but on a scale that's like 1,000 times bigger than the biggest tree that exists today. But all around are the smaller version of the same species of tree. You have cypress all over the place, you have pine. And so you literally will see a chunk, which would have been something like this inside of the great tree, and it's 50 feet wide or 100 feet wide. And then on that and around it are growing the smaller version of the tree. So it's almost like moss, that the trees that we have today would have been like moss on the
Mhm.
great trees when they were alive. So it definitely is fractal, and it's obvious when you're seeing it because and that it's wonderful too because it makes it that much easier because you're looking at a gigantic example of something, and then you have a smaller version of it that's decomposing right in front of you, and you can look at the different pieces and pick them up and go, there it is. It's
Right.
identical in every way. It's not like you're reaching and trying to make it fit into your wild theory. It's like it just is what it is. It's self-evident.
That's awesome. I'm such a fan of that because I think the way I understood the Yuga ages was like essentially the Satya Yuga, the golden age is when the coherence is at the highest level. And so when you have like pure coherence through a being and all the raw materials are at that level of coherence, then you have the penultimate expression of the potential, like the original potential, and that goes for everything. And likes like, birds of a feather flock together. So the land would have reflected that, the organisms would have reflected that, and everything would have grown. I think there's something to the superhero movies where when they show a superhero upregulating, they grow in size. You never see them shrink. They actually expand and get bigger. Their strength, everything is multiplied. There's like a multiplication aspect. I think that's harkening back to maybe some genetic memory we have of all the way back. Who knows? So these and are systems because if it has a beginning, it has an end. So no matter what in the created realm, you have this stepping down effect. You have entropy. Entropy is a very real thing. You just see the stages of life, like something grows to its peak and then it starts to diminish, right? So I look at the epochs, the ages, just like that. It's not that it's wrong or bad to live in any one of these step down ages. It's just what your consciousness, it's just what you're relative to, or that aspect of your soul needs to experience at that particular, quote unquote time. Because when we're dealing with created things, we're dealing with time. I tend to think that internally we're eternal, but our soul needs to learn certain things in the time domain, and then that's why creation is here. But that's a whole nother conversation. The step down. So we go from these titanic beings. Who even knows if the Titans were here during, say, a golden age? Maybe that was the silver age. Who knows? Or the bronze age. But now we are that little moss. Like, we would technically be, to a being that's miles and miles big, we would be like the little gut bacteria. And all of us have thought that. I mean, how many analogs to that have you seen throughout your life? Or are we just in a giant's eye? Like, there's all these different things that I've heard throughout life. So the scale of everything, we're in this compressed zone right now, this little envelope, and that envelope will do its thing for as long as the course sees fit, and then boom, you go back to bigger scales later on. But as being like these little microvilli that we are, that still have a semblance of some consciousness where that we can observe things, we get these like little fractal like echoes. That's probably a good way of saying it. It's like an echo that harken us back to these times where things were much, much larger. Um, it is starting now to be shown in the way the narratives are, I guess you say, compounding. Like, a lot of the narratives, especially when it comes to geoengineering and weather engineering, weather modification, and these types of things, I'm starting to see where a bunch of interference has been run. And if people could actually look at things from the biogeology perspective, the interference that's being run could be squashed. So that's the direction I kind of wanted to talk to you about.
Yeah, well, one of the questions I get all the time is
Wow.
why would they lie about something like this? All right. That's something you're eyeing.
I cut up some hot peppers earlier. Like, I was making a
Oh,
nice, like, yeah, and I thought it was just a regular bell pepper. I'm not good at labeling my garden, so I was cutting it up, and that's a hot pepper. That's some. I got fire eyes right now. I'm gonna just put a patch on my eye. That's amazing. So you were saying, I'll just squint.
yeah, I'll give you some time to recover. What was I talking about? Lost the train of thought.
We were talking.
Um,
We were talking about narratives and like why we're lied
oh,
to.
yeah. So, if the big trees were a thing and the Titans were a thing, why would they lie about it? And, one of the obvious things is that it supports the heliocentric narrative, and the geological narrative is doubling back on the heliocentric narrative. But also when it comes to the trees and the beings, if they know what things really are, they have a big advantage over the people who don't, which would be just about everybody. So when it comes to mining the valuable elements and finding what they're looking for, they're going to have a jump on everybody else, and they're going to know which is the most valuable land and where they're going to find their whatever it is they want. And so that's a big one as far as I'm concerned. And I think mining has been done on a scale that we can't even fathom of this realm, and the terraforming that's occurred. That's something also that the archivist has talked about a lot, looking at the entire, Gulf of Mexico, that whole section of land. If you look on it on Google Earth, and you can see that like the entire coastline has been terraformed on a scale that just, boggles the mind and doesn't match North American history at all. So I think that that in the previous era, they were mining the Titans, and they used their flesh and the trees as well to create the realm and all of the great architecture that we see from the bygone eras. That was probably where their materials came from. I mean, some of it would have been geopolymer as well, which is your forte. We talked about that last time. But what are they using for their materials to make the geopolymers? They're still using the foundational elements, which are coming from these creatures from the past.
Yes. So, okay, geoengineering. This is what I want to talk about because it's all up in everybody's grill right now when it comes to people wondering about weather modification. I think it's finally hit that like crescendo within the mainstream consciousness, especially here in the States, when we had two significant hurricanes, or at least they were branded as super significant. Because who knows when you're looking at a digital animation, above,
It's true.
whether or not that digital animation is indicative of what's really occurring. I grew
point.
up with pilots. My uncle was a pilot. Both my grandfathers were pilots, and they flew smaller planes. So we would always check the wind speed at the local airports. And so I even do that now. It's really kind of easy nowadays where you can go online and find like whatever, small little airports around you, and they have very, very good wind monitoring devices. And now you can read any one of those devices in the country. Like they're all their data is constantly being posted. And so with Hurricane Helene, that hurricane makes its way up through the panhandle of Florida. And I had friends that were literally like on both paths of both Helene and Milton. So we're being told we're seeing this hurricane, and the projections. If you look closely at what the data is saying, it will tell you it's a projection. But they're saying sustained wind speeds of like a category 4 before it makes landfall. But the second it makes landfall, all the wind speed from these little airports is like it's not even a hurricane. It's like maximum sustained winds of 75 miles per hour, which makes like a hurricane. When I was growing up, when a hurricane would make landfall, you'd have a few hours of it with it maintaining its force. It would, pretty much on an exponential curve. When it was over land, it would lose its power, right? So when you look at the projections of Helene as it made its way up the Appalachian Trail, up through, for those of you that don't know your geography, like you go through the panhandle of Florida, then you go up, essentially up towards what we call the FAG, the Florida, Alabama, Georgia border, where a lot of people like Dr. Longo think that that's the four-headed river system talked about in the Bible, the real Garden
The
of
original
Eden.
Garden of Eden.
As you go up, as you go up, you pretty much, it went right over Atlanta, and then it goes into the lower Appalachian area, which is like hits western South Carolina and western North Carolina. And I grew up going up there. My family lived in Black Mountain, and so I have a lot of vested interest in that area of the world as I grew up with it, and I love it. I think it's an absolutely beautiful area. Um, but that when you were looking at the wind speeds of all the different places as it was going up, it was like it was barely a hurricane. I wasn't a hurricane. It was a tropical storm, then a tropical depression, but it got up to the Carolinas. But my goodness, did it drop a tremendous amount of water, like a massive boatload of water. And the people, like I was trying to talk to my community about that in an educated way because in 2011 in Costa Rica, we had a very similar weather pattern hit us, and we had tremendous flooding in the valley that I was in Central America because the weather pattern was somewhat similar. The pattern didn't have to go all that far because we were only like 7 kilometers inland, but it wasn't a tropical storm. It was tropical depression, and it came in after 5 days of rain. I think in the Appalachians they had 4 days of rain, and then this weather system came in, and then it was like 30 inches of rain over like a six to 8 hour period. We had like almost the same exact thing, and it's crazy. Like that's in ways that's much worse than any hurricane I had ever lived through. And I've lived like I've been in probably six full on anywhere from category 2 to category 4 hurricanes. I will tell you that rainstorm that we experienced in Costa Rica with that amount of rain was so much more destructive and so much more like absolutely nerve wracking to go through because when the ground reaches super saturation like that, that super saturation, when the real dump starts to happen, the internal aspect of your being feels so unsettled. Like the waters above and below are like it's all quaking and like nobody feels right. It's horrible feeling. And then obviously the destruction, it's not liquefaction per se. It's not like an earthquake shaking the ground, but all that rain coming down does kind of shake the ground in a way where you just get these crazy mudslides.
Mm.
And so that aspect of Helene was obviously horrible. Like they don't even know how many people have died, but it's more like it was like the perfect storm of like how you could get rid of some pesky Appalachian folk that are known to be very very hardy. And
And sitting on a bunch of lithium and quartz.
yeah, pure quartz, and that makes us think about like the geological formations that you talk about because you talk about a biodiverse, hyper fertile area. I mean, my goodness, like the Appalachians, the lower Appalachians, like that are magnificent. So you have that storm go on, and then FEMA says they have no money. FEMA goes, oh, for you guys up in Appalachia, there's no money. Sorry. Like we don't have any money. Then Milton comes back like I think 8 or 9 days later or something like that. And Milton, starts over by the Yucatan Peninsula to the west of it and then makes a beeline for Florida. And it's a like, dude, I tell you, Mike, in Florida, a category 2 hurricane is like, who gives a shit? Like all of us Floridians, like category 2 shmoo, who cares? Like we would even put up our wing guards for a category 2. They're hyping this thing up like it's a category 5. They're like the lowest millibar since Maria or whatever, and they make this storm massive. But my friends in Tampa are like, dude, this is chill. Like there's nothing really going on. Then it goes across the state water. Like any Floridian that's lived there any period of time wouldn't give a shit. Now I know the population of Florida pretty much doubled since COVID because it was a cool state to be in when all the COVID stuff was going down. And so you have a ton of people that haven't experienced a hurricane yet. They're essentially newbies. They move there, and the news is being up and everything like that. I was checking wind feeds, so I look at windy, and wind feeds are the projected power category 4 one big landfall. And then you look at the wind speeds in Tampa and Sarasota, and the wind speeds weren't even cracking like 100 miles per hour. And I was like, this is, there's some real, effery going on.
Yeah,
So
you made an interesting point at the beginning of just like it's just graphics on a computer screen, and I didn't even think about that. Like that they could be hyping up the force of the storm, and it's just fear porn and get everyone in a panic state and fleeing the state when in reality it's not that big of a deal. But I mean, obviously the destruction in North Carolina is pretty severe from the footage that I've seen, you know, it's made its way onto
yeah.
Instagram and other platforms. And it's devastating that people are cut off and they don't seem to be getting a whole lot of help, even though the government says they're help doing everything they can. You know, it's like, really? Are they?
Well, well, here's the tell. Milton's rolling through. FEMA goes, we got $11 billion for all you guys down there in Florida. So they have no money for the people. They have $750 million, so a little bit less, three-quarters of a billion for an area that's absolutely pretty much wiped off a map up in the Carolinas. They have, 15 times that with $11 billion in an area that's used to category two hurricanes. Like my best friend, his house it was right, the hurricane went right over his house. He's just dealing with down branches. He was out of power for a couple of days. Like any Floridian has backup generators. No,
Hmm.
it's no big deal. Like we would barbecue. I think when Katrina went over us in 2004 or five, I think we were out of power in Palm Beach County for 2 weeks. So what? We had barbecues, people were hanging out. It's a good time. Like,
Surfing.
is it like, well, no, after it passed, it was crazy how cold it got. Like when that when it went through, it pulled in the cold weather with it. It was really kind of cool. But so what I'm trying to say is you can kind of follow the money with all these things. And so I ended up doing a couple of pods with Jim Lee of the Climate Viewer. And Jim Lee is a big proponent of saying that the majority of what we see in weather engineering comes from this whole thing with the change of jet fuel. They changed the jet fuel to include all these metal salts back in around 1998. And ever since then, we see this haze in the sky. And then also, I living in Central America and also in India, what I notice is the majority of the roads in those countries are dirt roads, right? And the dirt is like a clay. And that clay you would see during the dry season, the clay, you would have a clay line, you'd have this dust that would lift up and up in the sky. And when you study what clay is, this got me thinking of you. This is where you come in. I was like, okay, so clay, for the most part, let's talk about the orange clay, the orange or red clay that most people think of. That is, we're told, is a combination of aluminum silicate along with magnetite, iron oxide. And those two, what gives it the red color. Now, iron oxide, guys, what else has a lot of iron in it, right? So, iron oxide is,
Blood.
yeah, right? Iron oxide is magnetite. But the thing is I've harvested magnetite from volcanoes. So I have very, like, I have this huge fascination and had a huge fascination with Ormus dating back to like 2007. And what was the gentleman that brought the Ormus to everybody's attention from Arizona? What was that farmer's name? Is it David? I'm forgetting his name. There was this gentleman that pretty much found out that his farm in Arizona had thousands of acres, but it had this layer of magnetite on it. And that magnetite is iron oxide. But when he was looking at it, he was seeing that the iron oxide in and of itself, I forget what his engineering background was, but he was able to analyze it. And he saw that this iron oxide had every other metal group attached to it. It was like it was the grand attractor. So by weight, it was mainly this iron molecule, but it had platinum group metals, it had gold group metals, it had silver, it had all this connected to it. And what he saw in certain circumstances, depending on the static of the weather that was coming in or whatever, he would see that these precious metal groups would separate from the iron oxide, and he called them monoatomic elements. They would become their lightest version of themselves. And his full term for this was called ORMUS, which is orbitally rearranged monoatomic elements. And then you had all these hypotheses that maybe this is what what God fed the Israel the original Hebrews. It was the manna from heaven, because it's a crazy thing when you give biological organisms very low calories but very high ormus. They seem to thrive. They seem to be like, it's almost like they don't even need food. But that's a whole different conversation. So what fascinated me in this local thing, tying it to all this weather modification, was he was talking about how in certain weather circumstances he would see above the like miles and miles and miles of his magnetite soil, he would see like this layer kind of rise, like it was almost like a haze. And that got me thinking, okay, we have people that are analyzing the sky now for whatever reason. They're saying, okay, we're being sprayed like bugs. People like to use the term chemtrails. They like to use all these terms with weather modification. We got Helene, we got Milton, we got all these things going on. They start to analyze the air, or excuse me, the water that is moving through the fluid of air above us, and they'll be like, oh my God, there's barium, there's aluminum, there's this. Well, there was a gentleman that actually was analyzing this out west also. His name was Clifford Carnicom. Have you ever heard of Clifford Carnicom?
Mhm.
He was
No.
analyzing, he was actually watching the chemtrails above him for years, and he was like noticing that his plants weren't doing so well when he would see these streaks in the sky. So he decided to start doing isolated water samples of the dew and then also rain whenever the rain would occur, and he was finding blood cells in a lot
Right.
of his he was finding red blood cells. And I haven't found the data of whether these red blood cells were, he thought they were from human or not. But a lot of the conspiracy theorists out there were like, oh my God, it's like a War of the Worlds thing. They're liquefying us and spraying, blah, blah, blah.
It's raining
All that's
blood.
very outlandish. I think this is what it is. And I wanted to hear your take on this, because we're going back to your biogeology. We're going back to scale. We have beings that are massive. These massive beings get petrified. Some of them die naturally, whatever. Obviously, their genetics would be in our land through whatever, weather patterns, whatever's going on, human intervention or stuff like that. We're driving on the remains of these old beings. Dust happens. Dust, depending on what is making that dust, it can negatively polarize and go up. Like it can get sucked up. Just like you have thermals with temperature, we have thermals with electricity. So you
Hmm.
have these thermals that pull up these charged particles, and these charged particles just happen to have some genetics connected to it. But because we don't have the right scale, we're thinking like little mossy humans, like little, troll beings that we are at the scale that we're at right now. We're thinking that like because we don't have the scale of our past, we're actually thinking that this is something that's being engineered now. You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
But it's not. It's that we're so small. like our actual purview, like the lens that we're looking through up and out is so teeny relative to what actually was here before. We're misattributing phenomenon to things that, like, if the scale was correct, we'd actually be able to describe it correctly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that what's actually happening is a natural phenomenon, not a man-made one. Is that what you mean?
Not necessarily. Like, I know weather modification is a real thing. Like
Oh yeah, no, I
I've
wasn't
modified the
suggesting
weather.
that. I just mean like it's the desiccated blood cells. That's what he was finding, right?
Exactly.
Which is basically just dehydrated blood cells.
Yes.
So he's finding all of this massive quantities of blood cells, and where are those coming from? Well, some, theorists would suggest that, oh, they're up there in the plains and they're spraying us with God knows what to make us
Hmm.
sick or to do whatever. Um, there's so many different threads that you tied together there. But I was a hang glider pilot for many years in California, so
Nice.
I was a micrometeorologist. I was watching the weather literally like a hawk because it was, I wanted to know when the right flying conditions were. And so when the whole chemtrail thing started, I spotted it right away. I'm like, that's not normal, that these planes
Hmm.
are the contrails are not dissipating like they're supposed to, there's something going on. And so I woke up to that one many, many, many years ago. And you also mentioned thermals. So the thermal activity is when the sun is heating the ground and that warm air starts to break off and rise. And it can do it as a
Hmm.
bubble or it can do it as a column. And it's not like a column, it goes straight up. It's, amorphous and it's just, but and as a hang glider pilot, I would look for those and you can't see them, but you can read the terrain and you can see how the winds are blowing and you can see the direction the leaves are facing and how they're shining in the trees and that will give you insight into where these updrafts of wind are, and you can fly into those. And then, most people think of hang gliding as like it's a paper airplane that you just throw and then it's going to glide to the ground because obviously a hang glider doesn't have a motor. But it for people who really know how to hang glide and they're doing cross country flying, you're looking for thermal activity and you're flying into those thermals and then you're basically corkscrewing up, just like you see birds do if you pay attention, they'll be like spiraling up. Like, why is that? That's because of the thermal activity. So this ties back into the concept of biogeology because the term that I appropriated, I didn't invent the term. It was already being used, but it was being used by a very tiny little subsection of the scientific community to actually describe the interplay between the geosphere, Earth, and the lithosphere. So basically, what it's talking about
Hmm.
is this percolation of materials upward into the upper atmosphere and into the lithosphere. So
Hmm.
that's what biogeology is if you actually look for it. The reason I appropriated the term is I figured how important is that term and how important is it to have a term to distinguish between mainstream geological narratives if they're bunk and what we're really seeing, which is that there's a much more direct connection between biology and geology. And so I thought, well, biogeology is the perfect term for that. And I went searching for it and I found it's very little used. So I'm like, that's perfect. And it wouldn't be needed if the geological narratives were accurate. And I don't believe they are anymore. And I think the best evidence for that is the trees. And anyone who needs convincing can go look at Hangman 1128's channel or just look at my channel, see the last, I put up about 10 or 12 2-minute videos in a row, which were just highlights from my travels with him. I did a recap of the whole adventure, which is worth watching as well. But if you're short on time, just watch those 2-minute videos and you'll see the evidence is overwhelming. And so understanding that major aspects of how we're told stone is formed are completely inaccurate. There needs to be some way of distinguishing between that narrative, and so that's how I chose the term biogeology. And so if going back to your comments about ormus and monatomics and everything, if you have a dying creature or a decomposing tree that's on a titanic scale, well, especially a creature where you've got a lot of blood, you're going to have iron. You're going to have, all of the magnetite as well. And it's interesting. I saw, I have, it's in one of my videos, but there's a photograph of like 4 slightly different types of magnetite. And all I've done is they've taken them and they've drawn on a piece of paper, each one of them. And some of the magnetite, it looks black, but when you draw on paper, it's blood red, which that's interesting. What if it's actually from blood,
That's amazing.
Um, and that ties into my research on the mountain, because after I was looking at the gross anatomy of the mountain and then getting into the eye socket and the ear and actually showing that there's a whole lot of very, very specific anatomical correlations, highly specific, and way too many of them for it to just be random chance. It's either we're in a simulation and the world is, the universe is kind of messing with me and has just kind of led me down this wild goose trail, or there's something to it. And it's almost weirder if there isn't, in my opinion, because then it's like, well, why is all this stuff lined up in absolutely perfect ways with loads and loads of synchronicities? Is it just a simulation? Is this just all for my entertainment? But obviously, the deeper I go into it, the more people who see this stuff, it might just be like an egregore where it starts to take on a life of its own. And now people all over the world are finding heart stones that are very specific. And, anyway, so after I had the major anatomy of the mountain kind of, under wraps and gone into the eye multiple times and shown how there's very specific anatomical features there that it's remarkably specific. Then I started looking at just the overall mountain and the stone that's all over. And the mountain is made of limestone. And we talked about this last time, but limestone in the mainstream narrative is said to be made of compressed coral, skeleton, shellfish, and mollusk, right? So you've got all of these different bony materials that have been compressed for hundreds of millions of years. And then there's a type of limestone that does match that description, which is coquina, which is what Coral Castle was made out of. And you can actually see the bits and pieces of these things with the naked eye. And so I've hiked around this mountain for the last 13 years, and I never have once seen any hint of any of those things in any of this limestone. Instead, what you get are 2 different main types of limestone. One are big blocks that have very little holes in them, but when there is a hole, it's larger and it's fractal, it bifurcates. So you have a big kind of organic looking channel going in, and then there are channels that are going off in the sides in different directions. And those make no sense from an erosion perspective. Like water could work its way in and create a fissure and then wear away at that and then create some kind of a channel. But this is channels within channels that are bifurcating, just like blood vessels would, or just like trabecular bone would, which is the other kind of bone. So you've got the compact bone, which is our long bones, or that's the hardest part of the bone. And then in the central portion of the bones is this trabecular bone that looks like Swiss cheese. That's where our red blood is produced. We've got our stem cells in there, and with the red blood is blood plasma. And so when I started to look at the constitution of blood and compare that to the mountain, it was a 100% overlay. It was like 1-to-1, So you've got the larger stones with their larger channels, and then you have this other kind of stone, which is everywhere, and I've got loads of videos showing it up close, and it looks like Swiss cheese, and it bifurcates. And in those channels, you often find very red earth and iron ore. Interesting correlation, right? Iron ore.
Ding, 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 ding.
It's stuck to the side of the limestone, and it's in the channels. And every once in a while, you'll see a channel that's actually lined with quartz as well. Now that's
There you go.
interesting because my theories about fat of all different types, so fascia, fat, disc, ligament, tendon, eye, all of these things that are white and fatty in my world are petrifying to different kinds of quartz. So that's what you would expect to find if there was some kind of a blood vessel. You would expect to find some petrified quartz in there. So that's what I'm finding.
Mhm.
It's those are the four components. You've got the limestone, you've got the red earth, you've got the iron ore, and you've got the quartz, and it all lines up perfectly with a titanic being's bone and what would be contained within that bone. And I've even got examples where parts of the stones have been broken away, exposing channels, and then oozing out of those channels. So oozing is just pouring out of those channels is this reddish earth that was trapped in the stone. So you could argue that, oh, well, that reddish earth was deposited by flooding, right? And the iron ore just happens to be there. But no, it's inside the stone. And everywhere on the mountain where it's broken away, you can see there's this discoloration or not discoloration, but rather the grayish oxidized or white limestone when it's broken away is revealing the more red internal structure of the stone and these channels as well. So just to bring that whole thread to a close, I was mocked by a geologist who was looking at my videos, and he's like, "This is ridiculous, these theories. If you just looked at the limestone with your naked eye, you would see the traces of the shellfish and the mollusk and the coral and the endo and exoskeletons that comprise this limestone." I was like, "No, that's not true at all." So I went out and I got started with a 60x microscope. And then later on, I found out I could get a 1000x microscope. It was Wi-Fi, and I could use my phone with it. So I was able to go out and use the phone, so I'm not having to look into the tiny hole of a microscope. And I could film and actually record with my camera. So I've got different videos on the microscopy of the mountain as well. There's no hint, even at 1000x, of any of those components that should be there. That's impossible, in my opinion. Even if you buy the mainstream geological narrative of hundreds of millions of years, compressing all of that dead life into a limestone layer, at some point somewhere, at least with a microscope, you should be able to find a hint of that. There's no hint of it anywhere. So, yeah, I mean, going back to your idea of the blood cells falling, well, that's probably what all that reddish earth is made of, and the iron ore as well. And that can be kicked up by wind or thermal activity, and it can percolate its way upward into the upper atmosphere, especially if you've got major storms coming through that are whipping everything up. And then that could come down and settle. So, and like you said, it doesn't have to be the barium, strontium, and aluminum that the stratospheric injection is delivering to us. It could also be a natural phenomenon. So I think you're spot on there.
So think about this, because we just had, I forget what meteor shower we had a couple weeks ago, but it was one of the bigger ones.
Perseid,
So
I think.
it might have been. I'm terrible at remembering the names of them. I had, as this was going on, I had it in my mind. I was thinking about atmosphere. We should call it atmosphere. This
Atmos
fluid
plane,
that we
yeah.
look up above us, the atmos plane. So let's just call it the fluid that's above us, because it's it's good to understand that the air is a fluid.
Yes.
The air that's above us is mainly comprised of gas, nitrogen, some oxygen, there's some hydrogen, and then all the other noble gases, blah blah blah. But also in this fluid that's above us, this fluid is technically a colloid, because colloid has all these suspended particles in it. And those suspended particles will stratify depending on their density and their charge. So in these discussions that I was having, talking about temperature differential, pressure gradients, and weather modification, and non-weather modification, just weather, let's just say organic weather, there's a charge differential between the upper atmosphere, not just the upper atmosphere, but there's an incredible charge differential from our upper atmosphere to the ground. The ground, for most part, we can just say has a negative charge with infinite capacitance. And then we
And
have,
that potential it's 100 volts per meter, I believe, right?
yes, yeah. So for those of you out there that don't know what a meter is, it's essentially a little bit more than 3 feet.
In a
It's
yard.
39. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
39 and a quarter inches.
Yeah.
So
So if
for
you have a
every,
tether going up every meter, you're tacking on 100 volts.
so this is where I think you will, out of anybody I've spoken to about this, you will get this thread quicker than anybody. So I'm talking to Jim Lee, and Jim Lee of the Climate Viewer, he's telling me like, yeah, they usually inflate these numbers. There's this whole kick to make everybody think the storms are getting bigger and worse because of the UN, blah 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 blah. I think all of that's pretty true, but in the
Cow farts.
same discussion, he's like, yeah, in the same discussion, he's also like, yeah, they go ahead and put on these AWAC planes that fly over these storms. They've been experimenting with shining coherent light through them, and they find whenever they shine a laser, which is coherent light, from above, like, so say this is the top of the thunderhead and they're flying over it. If they shine light down through the thunderhead, wherever that light goes, lightning discharges there. All the lightning needs, all the charge differential that we just spoke about for every meter that you go up, there's 100 volts. If you're a few miles up, that's millions and millions of volts. Well, that
Wow.
voltage, it finds a pathway from one potential, the positive potential, to the negative ground, because the ground has infinite capacitance relative to us, meaning it can take the charge.
Absorption ability. Yeah.
It can take the charge. Okay. So Father Sky wants to inseminate Mother Earth. That's just the way it is. And it usually does that with electricity. So I'm like looking, I'm hearing Jim, and he's like, boom, lightning is caused by this coherent light. And I instantly thought of these places in Venezuela and Costa Rica where when the volcanoes are erupting, you'll just get this lightning discharge going through. I was a volcano in northern Costa Rica one night, and I saw probably 1,000 lightning bolts hitting this
Oh, I
upper
lost you there,
atmosphere
Topher.
where the lava.
Can you just repeat like the last 10 seconds? I lost you there for a moment.
So I've been near volcanoes before where I've seen thousands of lightning bolts like striking the
Mm.
same part of the volcano. And now what Jim told me about the coherent pathway, because he says what a lot of the weather modifiers have figured out is that if you just give this a pathway of infinite potential, if you give it a pathway, a coherent pathway, it will just discharge wherever that pathway is. So they're using laser beams. Nature will use, let's say, gases that have lots of magnetite in them. Because guess what? The number one distributor of magnetite in the world as we know it are volcanoes. When a volcano erupts, the gases
Volcanic
that
ash.
volcanic ash, the pozzolanic ash, is rife with these little particles of iron oxide, but in the form of magnetite. So I was like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool. And I'm thinking, okay, the atmos plane is this colloid that's full of God knows what desiccated geological material that's kind of suspended in it. Us humans, we're adding our own metals to it now, here, there, and forever, right? And I'm thinking about all this, and then like, people in our vein of thinking are like, what are meteorites? Like, what are comets or meteorites? And I was like, wait a minute, a meteorite? Thank you, sweetheart. Look at what my daughter just brought in. She's such a good little flower picker.
Oh,
You know. So I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, these meteorites always come in at the same time in the same area of the sky. I bet you that is a discharge. I bet you that that's a pathway of electricity that's going through a very specific part of the colloid. And the reason why they can say, hey, that's coming from another planet, the materialist point, is because nobody knows about the instant petrification. Nobody knows that if you send a certain amount of plasma through a colloidal, a colloid, I'll just say a colloid, it will aggregate all of the different particulates that it can and cohere them. And they'll say, yeah, the meteorites, by the time it hits the Earth and we can find it, it's so super hot. And they say, because it's traveling through an atmosphere. And I'm like, not at all. There's literally a pathway of infinite potential from Father Sky to Mother Earth that's zipping through the colloid at that particular area. It superheats it. And that brings me back to our original discussion where I was telling you about the spheres in Costa Rica. Those spheres were just lightning hitting, bauxite.
yeah,
Anybody
you're
can
talking
do,
about the concretions. For people who
yeah,
don't know what he's talking about, they're these concentric spheres. If you do a cross section of them, but they can be huge. Do an image search for concretions. But they also have cave pearls. You're familiar with those as well?
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Tell people about them.
Yeah, it's the same idea, but it's on a smaller scale, and I can't remember what the mainstream narrative for how those form, what that is, but to me, it seems pretty evident that they're formed through some kind of electrical phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is, I always look at what we can replicate. And just like that gentleman that you're talking about can make rubies, with a couple of powders and high arcing plasma in an actual microwave. NASA was the one who taught me about the whole thing with, turning bauxite into an igneous rock into making it into a concretion. Because you had all these, I guess you'd say, desk jockeys like railing at NASA because pretty much people were taking NASA's Mars rover as if it was gospel, like as if it was real. And so you had all these nerds looking at the way the tires were made for the Mars rover, and they're like, there is no way in Mars's atmosphere you'd use tires like that. So NASA did this whole spin trying to teach all the nerds that think all that's real the reason why they made the tires that way. And then that's how I learned about how they do high arcing plasma through bauxite to make bearings, to make porcelain bearings. It was through NASA trying to cover their ass about their Mars rover. It's funny how sometimes lies can reveal the truth. And so I'm sure those videos are out there somewhere. I haven't seen them in many, many years. But what do you think about this meteorite theory of like there we have a suspension, a colloid that is suspending all types of particles. Depending on the local environment going up relative to where a meteorite lands, would depend on what the actual material would be. And they say, oh, this material isn't from this Earth. It's not on our periodic scale or whatever. It'd have to be some sort of other element. I think all that's BS. I think what occurs is that there's always discharging coming from above, from heaven. That's what heaven means, from above. And sometimes it will go through the suspension, through the colloid, at different, rates of pressure and speed. And that's why we have these different forms and shapes of these concretions, as you would say, that are called a meteor.
Yeah, well, you were talking about like a colloidal channel, and when you were saying that, I was thinking more along the lines of if we are in an enclosure and there is some kind of a physical barrier, call it firmament, if you will. Um, if you think of like one of these plasma balls that you can buy, and when you touch the ball, obviously that's arcing to that point, and it'll follow your fingers, and
Hmm.
so it might be that these areas where we see all this extra activity just happen to be areas that are touched from outside, like specific points on the enclosure that get more action than others. It's just something that occurred to me. Um, and uh,
Hmm.
and then when it comes to the whole ash thing, that like they recorded the biggest electric storm in history. Did you get the pepper in your eye again?
I did. I'm not that bright. I'm sort of I'm sort
You're
of
like
slow on the draw here.
eyes are doing weird stuff. You're either possessed
Yeah.
or you got okay. Uh, sorry, I got a little
The
distracted
the
there.
the
Uh,
the colloid jumped up and got me.
yeah. Um, so yeah, they just recorded like a year or two ago the biggest plasma storm ever witnessed, and it was over a volcano. So the way in which volcanic ash helps these charges, move about and reach the ground is very evident. Um, and then
Well,
that
well, check this out. You're gonna like this. I think you might already know this. Do you ever remember the old plaque that used to be in the on the floor lobby of the Empire State Building? The plaque that stated what the purpose of the Empire State Building was?
no.
The plaque said that this was, they called it the New York State Authority of Electricity or something like that. And it said that that building was responsible for electrifying Manhattan.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So and I've tried to find these videos in the last 6 months. They're all gone from YouTube. But back in
Hmm.
the day when YouTube was the bomb, there were videos of time-lapse photography of lightning hitting the Sears Tower, of hitting the Empire State Building, essentially
Wow.
hitting the highest buildings that there were. And so we're talking about if you give the potential coherence, it will discharge to a point. Well, I've been teaching my audience about how just with shapes you can build coherence. And so a lot of people like to bring up the pyramids, right? The ratio of the angles at the 52 degrees. And like a lot of people are why would they do that? And I bring up, well, that shape at 52 degrees, that's actually the exact relationship of oxygen to hydrogen. So let's say you go ahead and want to bring in, like, let's say the memory of all of existence. You would build a building that would have that fractal component that we're talking about to that which holds memory, which is water. Water, for all intents and purposes, is just a relationship of hydrogen to oxygen. That's what it is. So now, let's just say you have an infinite hall of records because you built a fractal of that out of all this mass, out of limestone, quote unquote. And now when you're in those buildings, let's just say now you just have infinite memory when it works. It could be something like that. For something that we can test is like we have smaller versions of lightning rods. And what do lightning rods do? They always bring you up to a point, a peak pinnacle point that's pretty high up. And that's giving a discharge. Now we're told because it's a conductor and it's high, that works well. Well, as a kid living in the lightning capital of the United States, which is Broward County, Florida, I was like, why are they building these metal buildings that are conductors that are so high? Like, isn't that just a big lightning rod, right? Well, some of these buildings, like the Empire State Building, when you look at the original photos of it, like literally everything's going to this little needle that's like 1,300 feet up in the sky. And the actual plaque in the lobby says this is responsible for the electricity in Lower Manhattan. Like that's what it said.
Hmm.
And there was apparently in the basement of this thing massive, massive battery banks. And there's all this time lapse photography of all these like you guys think Back to the Future was a lie? They were
Mhm.
harnessing lightning for power. Like it's just given to you from the sky. It's like, okay, perfect, let's do it. So I've been
Well, that was.
showing with shapes, like if you take, if it, let me just finish the thing with the shape. Whenever you don't even need conductive material, the Russians figured this out. If you get the shape just right, you can use PVC, you can use whatever material you want. And what occurs is there's a coherence. In magnetics, they call it flux line density. You get a density of flux, which is just another way of saying a very tight band of coherence right here. That's where the electricity wants to go to. Like there, this can't be coincidental. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm. Yeah, well, your description of the Empire State Building is a nice complement to something we talked about in the last conversation, which is the unequivocal, once again, evidence that the buildings were powering themselves. So you've got the electrical aspects of it that you just described, and then we have these old world buildings with their metallic domes and the spires, and then you have
Mm-hmm.
this guy who I described last time, who was receiving a lifetime achievement award for doing works on the different the plumbing systems and the generators that were in these old world buildings. And he basically lays out exactly how they were powering themselves. And I described driving a shaft down into the earth to the point where the heat is so great that you can boil water and then turn that to vapor. And then they would have a second shaft coming up, and that they would channel the steam through that. And then that steam would be
Mm-hmm.
used to turn turbines. So you're describing battery packs from the electrical. So that's charging the batteries inside the buildings. And then they also
Mm-hmm.
had turbines that would turn that, and all they needed was an unlimited water source because they could just pump the water down. It would boil to steam, and it's a 1,700 to 1 conversion between liquid and vapor, and that would turn your turbines. And then also they would use the vapor, the hot steam, to heat the buildings. So they have all these old world
Right.
radiators that it's just hot air going through all these things. So I came across writings where they were talking about how, you know, these are places that have harsh winters. They had these buildings that could have the windows open, and they could be comfortable and dressed like I am in the middle of winter with the windows open, right? Because they had
Mm-hmm.
just this unlimited amount of energy that the buildings themselves were channeling and tapping into. So going back to this whole potential between higher and lower, thinking about the trees, if you imagine Titanic-sized trees in the rainforest, the wildlife that lives in the rainforest, 80% of it lives in the canopy of the trees. Like it's not,
Right.
most of it is not crawling around on the ground. They're up in the trees. So if you have trees that are stretching, who knows how high up into the sky, many miles or perhaps hundreds, they're going to be a lot closer, and they're going to be a very, very, you know, that's going to offer a huge amount of potential between the high and the low when we're talking about this voltage. And so if there were to be some kind of a major electrical storm and the trees were to get hit by the plasma apocalypse, if you will, all of that life that's up in the trees is going to get hit, and that's going to rain down, obviously. Um,
Yes.
but um, but also you're going to have this, you know, going back to what we were talking about, the ormus and the monatomics going through the the creature or through the trees, those are going to align themselves in different ways. So that gives rise to your elements. And then I was thinking of the word weather vane. Those are at the top of the buildings, right? And what are they?
Hmm.
Those are
You're right.
attracting lightning as well. And it's got the word vein in it, just like coal, like
Exactly.
silver vein, gold vein, our veins. It's like they're using the same words over and over. And is that by accident, or are they just, uh, they want to remember themselves what they're talking about after so many lies, or they're hinting at it,
Hmm.
for those of us who've been taught other things. So yeah, I think all those different subjects tie together very very nicely in a way that makes a lot of sense when you just think about the simple physics of it. And
Well,
yeah.
I love this. I love this vein of query because it ties in, the bigger question of what is our weather, along with what is our geology slash biology. Like it's a very holistic way of seeing this grander environment. Like it's an environment that if the scale is correct, I think you can more accurately model things. And the notion of being like some sort of, cue ball, whirling through space, and having all this extracurricular activity occurring because of something out there in the void, it can kind of eliminate all of that if the scale is correct of what this plane of existence actually is. And I just love your throughput line with the biogeology because it's very obvious to me that life is the organizing principle, and we're literally living on the backs of giants. And at one
And
time, when they were
the
alive,
ancients told us that as well. That was part
yeah,
of their religious, their mythological tales were on the backs of the ancients, and the stones are our grandparents and our ancestors. When I was younger, one of my favorite lines was "Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise." And
yes,
I was so enamored of this idea of, we got to get out and explore the universe and make sure that we get off of this rock before we get hit by an asteroid, and or blow ourselves up with nuclear war. And so something like archaeology and geology, those subjects were literally the most boring things I could think of, like rocks, like
definitely.
go dig in the dirt, and these people that have got their brushes and they're excavating these different structures meticulously over years. I'm like, that is literally the most boring thing I can imagine. And now it's like it's the opposite. I think so many children would be just totally turned on and blown away by geology if there was this more direct connection of this was once maybe this or that. And we're really, it's a new frontier now, because as we start to explore these things, there's no settled science on anything. We're just trying to figure out the basics of things right now. The more we learn, the more
Right.
it all seems to dovetail, but it's not like there's a test a Titan kit out there that you can just go and figure out, was this a woolly mammoth, or what was that mountain once upon a time? There's like that, short of making use of spectroscopy, and these are very expensive measuring devices that, unless you've got a lot of money or access to one of them directly, you're not going to be making use of that anytime soon. Um,
Hmm.
how do you prove this stuff unequivocally? It's challenging, because you can't just point and claim. You can't just look at things and go, well, it looks like that, because then they'll just accuse you of the Dunning-Kruger effect and pareidolia and apophenia and all of these pitfalls that they say that we're all falling into when it comes to research, because we're naive and we don't know what we're talking about, and we haven't studied these things, and we think we're experts. But if this stuff is true and biogeology is a thing, nobody's an expert, right? Like I
Right.
had an interview with Chance earlier this week, on the Universe podcast. And when he initially wrote to me, he's like, you're the only Titanologist I know. You know, it was like someone once asked me, they heard me, you know, in an interview, and one of the comments afterwards was like, what are you? Like, you know, what's your background? And it's like, I'm a chiropractor. I'm just interested in these things, and you know, asking you know unconventional questions and coming up with very strange answers. And so my response, you know, was tongue in cheek, and I just said, I'm a Titanologist. You know, so it's like there is no field of Titanology yet. And you know, biogeology is definitely a budding discipline. So you know, all hands to deck.
You
You
know,
know, it's like
you know where you could have a great synergy, and I love Chance. I was talking to Chance earlier today. His wife is very pregnant, and
I heard.
our families are friends. So I was checking in to make sure everything was good on that front. Um, so he's so good. I love Chance. Um, you back in the day, you and I have listened to a lot of the same stuff throughout the years. His name was Brooks, Dr. Brooks. It might be Agnew. He was the gentleman that claimed to have the patent on ground penetrating radar. And he said
Hmm.
that I think if that's, I might be misquoting the name. I'm not the best with names. But he said, I forget when it was in the 90s or 80s, that they used this ground penetrating radar and it caused an earthquake in Japan. And then
Hmm.
that's when he became very hip to, oh, this earth isn't shaped, it's not comprised of like the way they said it was. He was a big
Yeah.
hollow earth. He was a huge hollow earth person. And then I think in his latter years, if he might still be alive, I think he ran something called X3 radio back in the day. I don't remember, but he was talking about using ground penetrating radar to find these veins of oil. That's where he made most of his money for the oil companies. And I think something like that with LiDAR and what you do would be incredible. You should have a GoFundMe or you should have a donor like donate money to you with LiDAR because you could go and spelunk into an eyeball of a Titan that looks like a, you know, whatever, and you could LiDAR it and you could show in a three-dimensional model unequivocally it's the same as an elephant eye socket nowadays.
Well, that, you know, it's funny you say that because that was the third unveiling a Titan video was for me the most mind-blowing thing of all when I got into all this research because I had gone up to the eye and examined the eye, and then I just theorized that side of the mountain is so well preserved. If the eye and the
Mhm.
eye socket is so perfect and has all of these features within it that match up with the anatomy, there's also this discoloration where the ear would have been. You know, it's like a quarter
Yes.
moon shape. And so I was like, maybe there's a cave up there. And as I started to look into where to find, you know, such a cave, I came across the name of the canyon, and then I found out as I was trying to find my way up that there is a cave up there, and it just happens to be right in the center of that quarter moon shape. Like, what are the odds of
Yeah.
that? But beyond that, which is, I mean, this is where it gets mind blowing, and every time I tell a story, I start to get goosebumps. Is that a whole team of both archaeologists and geologists? They went up into this cave. They had to get climbing gear and ropes and everything, and it's at 375 meters altitude. And they went in with I'm not sure if they used LiDAR, but they went in with 3D mapping tools. So they mapped the entire inside of this cave. And so I didn't even know any of this, and I didn't know this had been done. I didn't know the cave existed, and I found all of this out in one afternoon when I started clicking on links, and all of a sudden I was watching literally them fly through this cave that looks a hell of a lot like an ear canal. And
Right.
they're using 3D photography. So if you have the red and blue glasses, you can see it in 3D as they fly through it, and it comes down. And then also they mapped it with 3D mapping tools. So they like show animation. It's not even an animation, it's the actual mapping of the internal of the cave. And so in all of the Unveiling of Titan videos, the opening like 30 seconds, it shows exactly what I'm talking about, so you can see it very easily. And it's just like, what are the odds of that? But when it comes to the whole ground
Where
penetrating,
can people
they
find your Unveiling Titan series?
it's if you go to the Stellar, it's right there. My name's Stellium 7 on the screen. That's the channel name. And if you go to the playlists, you'll see them, and you can see the Unveiling of Titan series, and you can see I have a playlist for petrified Titans and organs, or petrified organs specifically. And then for people who don't, I recommend skipping the first video that I made, Unveiling a Titan 1, because I would totally remake that. It was the first video I ever made. It's the one that's got the highest view count on my channel because it's the first one in the series. So that's where people start. A lot of people start with that one and then they like, and they drop off. Start with the second one, and you'll see how
Okay.
thorough and specific I've gone in to these subjects, and I'm doing 3D comparisons of the anatomy of the eye socket, showing all the bones and how the bones of the eye socket meet, and the different lines that those form, and that the lines are exactly where they should be inside the cave, and a whole lot more. There's over 50 anatomical correlations that I've accumulated over the years that I've been examining the mountain. But going back to the ground penetrating radar, as I understand it, there's serious limitations as to how far it can penetrate and how much accuracy they have when it comes to what they're looking at and what they're expecting to find. Like the Kola borehole in Russia, which is the deepest hole ever dug. It's 12 kilometers, 8 miles deep. It took them like 20 years. And from what I understand, they kept trying to predict what was coming next, and they were wrong like many times. So when we're looking at our school books and they're showing us the Earth, they're showing cross sections of the Earth, and this is the Earth's crust, and this is the mantle, and this is the core, and they have all these fancy cartoon graphics that are presented as fact. And I want to know, like, is there any fact there? Have they actually proven any of those claims? Because we're told it's an 8,000-mile diameter, but the deepest hole ever dug was 8 miles, and it took 20 years. So that means everything else that they're claiming to know about the inside, they have to somehow proven with instrumentation. And then they tell us ridiculous stories like you have a rotating molten iron core, and that rotation is giving rise to our Earth's electromagnetic field, but yet magnets lose all of their coherence when you melt them, right? They're no
Yep.
longer magnetic when they're turned to fluid. So how is a
Right.
rotating fluid giving our constant magnetic, phenomenon on the Earth? So um, yeah, the ground penetrating radar, and that tied into, I wanted to talk really briefly about De Re Metallica, which is an old book from the 1500s. That's a Spanish book where they're talking about all kinds of things geological, and that's been translated into English, and it's free on archive.org, I guess. But that's recently, was it? No, not archive.org. The Wayback Machine was hacked, I heard the other day. Like the
Hmm.
like major portions of internet history just went bye-bye, folks. So if you're sitting on valuable information and there are videos that you constantly refer to that are things that are interesting to you, you better be downloading them because they're not going to be around forever. It's
It's true.
so, get your PDF books and everything, and real books as well, because it's crazy times we're in. Like the biggest book burning ever envisioned is happening before our very eyes.
Oh, oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And ink, what's the old saying? You know, paper or ink has never shied away from paper. Like the way, the context in which that's being said is that there's a lot of bullshit out there that's been written down also. Like
Oh yeah.
I would say 2/3 of the books I've owned in my life are utter garbage. So
Yeah,
I
and
people,
even the old books. I mean, it's pretty obvious. There's massive quantities of texts that have been, you know, completely fabricated by the Vatican and other
yeah.
entities that have a vested interest in obfuscating our past and teaching us lies. So yeah, the De Re Metallica book is very interesting because it I think it hints far more at what the real nature of our realm is. So that's definitely worthy of looking into.
How do you spell that? Dure Metallica.
DE space RE space Metallica, like the band. And I have I have a video about it, but I don't remember the title of the video.
Well,
There's all kinds of
wait.
ways to determine where metals are, like gold, for example,
Mhm.
looking for gold veins by the kinds of monatomics that are in the leaves of the trees. I think I might have told a story last time we talked about a friend who was once working on a project where they were actually modifying plants so that they would respond to explosives. So that if a landmine was near the plant, just the nearness to the different materials that were in the landmine would alter its chemistry in a way that could be seen from the air using infrared photography. How's that for a far out project, right? And the reason they wanted to do this was once they started making plastic landmines, it's incredibly dangerous to children who are getting their limbs blown off. And you can't just easily go out into the field with a metal detector and dismantle these things because they're made out of plastic. So they're not showing up by metal detectors. So someone got the idea that they could seed the ground in these areas where the landmines are suspected to be with these modified plants, and then they would be able to fly over, and they could literally see, like as if you were looking at infrared hotspots or something. They could see
Mhm.
where the landmines were because of their proximity to these plants. It's just amazing.
That's awesome. That's absolutely amazing. Mike, let's cap this off by kind of going into a, a cosmological model, okay? And let's combine, you know, the Thunderbolts project, like the electrical universe aspect, because I always liked how they brought up a lot of technology from the past with Medusa and plasma, and that kind of goes into your biogeology with instant petrification through plasma streams, because Medusa would essentially, you know, we see it as like, you know, Clash of the Titans, like it's an actual face, and there's these like, you know, sneaks for her hair. Let's just say that Medusa was actually the god Net of of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians would actually say your bone, your ka, like the ka of you, the spirit of you, was in your bones. Okay, and they had this where the word night is derived from, if I remember correctly, is from the god Net, and she's above us, right? And when she gets angry, man, she like turns into this Medusa figure, and she's turning everybody to stone. She's turning their bone into limestone, let's say. And then with every reducing age that you go, and by reducing, going from the gold to the silver to the bronze to the iron, you get a smaller and smaller scale because the potential is reduced every time you step down the age. Does that model sound pretty decent to you? Like with how the with what how you understand your geography and your biology?
Yeah, I like that idea. It resonates with me. Thinking of Medusa, you've also got Cthulhu, which is, this kind of tentacle monstrous creature. I think anytime we're dealing with snakes or tentacles, what we're probably talking about is plasma, and because that's the way plasma
Right.
moves. If
Yes.
people, you and I both have talked about Lapointe's the Primer fields many times. If the audience hasn't seen
Hmm.
those videos, those are, it's a couple hours of your time that you learn so much just from visually observing how magnetics and noble gases, when charged with electricity, how that creates plasma and all of these different um, ways in which it manifests depending on the position of the magnets and the angles and which gases are being charged. And it's just so much, I think, that you grasp intuitively when you see that stuff. And when thinking about the Thunderbolts project, that their whole model of the universe is an electric universe, but I think they still are on the space model and helio. They're trying to fit their
Yeah.
stuff into heliocentrism, which to me doesn't really make sense. Their stuff would make way more sense on a
That's-
in a different cosmological model. So I don't know, um, you know, if they've considered that, but um, and then that, the Phoenix event, which is spoken of by Jason from Archaics. I think these are all just different ways of talking about the same kind of cyclical, cataclysmic, eschatological events that have shaped our realm and have caused these different great dyings off of the plant life and the animal life, going from the Titanic to the gigantic to where we are today. And
mhm.
all of these things seem to really work well together when you see all the data points and you see how they dovetail. It's
Yes.
but to people who haven't done a lot of research into these subjects, like you and I obviously have been digging into this stuff for years, it can sound like word salad that we're throwing out. And we're like just trying to sound really intelligent by talking about a whole bunch of stuff most people have never heard of. And that's not the case at all. There's so much stuff that just lines up really beautifully in ways that it shouldn't. If these were just crazy ideas and we were trying to
Hmm.
bend reality to match our harebrained ideas.
I think the word, I'm not to say that this psychological condition doesn't exist in the negative form, but I keep being told about the condition of apophenia, where you're making links between disparate things, like things that shouldn't be connected. The problem is, the most brilliant people I know, they make connections between things that are would seem to standardly educated people and people who don't care and don't want to know about their reality. To those subsect of people, they actually think life is a lot more coincidental.
Right.
The more brilliant people I know could all be termed to be suffering from apophenia. And I actually think that this existence is holotropic. Like technically none of it can be disconnected. Like you can't isolate anything. Like it once you understand what this place is, how experience actually even happens, it's impossible to even say you cannot isolate a variable. It's impossible. Even the act of observing a variable in your existence implies a link. So when you extrapolate that out, it is apophenia. It like literally everything is connected. Like the head bone's connected to the neck bone. And so
Right.
I'm not saying that people are incorrect in making links sometimes, and some people don't stretch to kind of have confirmation biases and all that. But I'm hearing way too often now in the modern let's just say in the standard news cycles, I'm hearing, I can tell that they're prepping people for this, to use apophenia, or to the people that actually connect dots are suffering from some sort of mental illness. Like I can feel that being presaged right now. And
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, so
I'm like,
you have cherry picking, which
right,
is you're just like picking, like, you know, like me with the heartstones. I'm just picking just the ones that look like hearts, and they're not acknowledging that I'm also being incredibly specific and showing that it's not just
right,
the shape, it's a whole bunch of other very, very specific anatomical features that are repeating over and over again. I've gone out live and I've recorded myself finding them. I've sliced them open, I've CAT scanned them, I've polished them, I've broken them open, you know, and it's like it's a pattern that is reoccurring far, far too often. So they would say that that's apophenia, that I'm recognizing a non-existent pattern, and that I'm cherry picking in order to support my pattern. And then they would also uh, say it's pareidolia. Things look like things, right? And you just because something looks like something doesn't mean that it is something. Then they'll bring up the doctrine of signatures, which is that things do look like things. You can find flowers that look like animals, but they're not animals, they're flowers, right? But they look identical. And then there's the doctrine of signatures is also used to describe how certain plants and vegetables and fruits have beneficial value to our health. And the body part that they are good for, they also tend to look like or be shaped like. So that's also part of
right.
the doctrine of signatures. So these are all the kinds of things that they'll throw at somebody like me. And I sent my rocks off to a laboratory and I got back no data. I got back a whole bunch of claims about stuff. And then they spent a lot of time basically trying to, you know, hand wave dismiss my findings without actually addressing any of the findings. I have a long video about that called Paradigm Crushed, where I go through and I break down every claim they made. And because I had audios, they recorded my phone call with them, and then the phone call where they were uh, analyzing the results of the supposed study, which there was no study. The whole thing is just ridiculous, but it's an interesting example of what can happen when somebody like me attempts to like seek some kind of a mainstream validation through science for an idea that would actually undermine an entire ology. um, so that video is called Paradigm Crush. But just to wrap up that thread of what I was talking about, when I was speaking with Chance earlier this week, he introduced me to a new concept called ultra-crepidarian, and I had
Yeah,
never heard this term before. And basically, it's the perfect rebuttal to someone who's accusing somebody like me or you of apophenia, because they're coming from, if we're correct about any of this stuff, they are coming from a complete system of indoctrination where they've been lied to about so many different things, but they think they're experts because they've, you know, checked all the boxes and dotted their I's and crossed their T's and gotten their certificates at the end of their education. By the way, I have two of those certificates, and most of what I learned was absolute bullshit. You know,
right,
and so they consider themselves to be experts in their field. But if their entire ology is based on fallacious reasoning, I would cite virology as an example. There's a lot of exposés that are being done on all of the
right.
pseudoscience that is virology, and cosmology as well. It seems all of the ologies have all been hijacked and are you know, they're inherently flawed at their core. And so if they can get you asking the wrong questions, then it doesn't matter what your answers are, because a broken clock is going to be right a couple times a day, right? If it's an analog clock, twice a day it'll be right. And so you're always going to be fitting your anomalous finds into this faulty model. And then eventually you're going to make pieces fit together and think you've discovered something. But ultimately, the entire foundation of what you're looking at is based on faulty premises. So I call that paradigm blindness, that those people are blinded by their paradigm. They're not necessarily intentionally trying to mislead or lie to us, but they're, you know, they're victims of the system, the academic system that they've grown up in. So the ultra-crepidarian is the idea that they think they know, but they really don't know. So they're accusing us of suffering from apophenia because they're
Right.
ultra-crepidarians, and you can look
I
that
love it.
term up. And yeah, so that was that. Thanks, Chance, for that one. I appreciate that
Yeah,
that bit of information.
that's
So yeah, go ahead.
an awesome term. Chance is so good like that to create something like that.
Oh, he
We've
didn't
actually
create it.
talked
That's an
about that.
actual term.
Oh, I thought he
It's
made that up.
no, no. I asked him. I was like, "Is that one of your creations?" And because I thought maybe he'd mix words together, because I love to do that myself, like,
Uh,
you know, truncate or squish words together to create some new thing that should exist but doesn't. No, that's an actual
ne
term that I had
Never
never
mind,
heard of.
Chance. Never
Yeah.
mind, Chance. All
No,
of my compliments to you.
he's great. He's great for a lot of things, but not. So yeah, and just to kind of wrap up, when it's come to my research, because I knew with the mountain, like this is the silliest idea ever, and no mainstream thinker who believes kind of what you're supposed to believe about reality is going to ever entertain this idea of this mountain being a former creature. And I knew that from the beginning, so
Right.
I wasn't setting out to make a fool of myself and to you know, become the laughing stock of the internet. Um, and if it wasn't really for the heart stones that I started to analyze, which I've shown, I went into a lot more detail, you know, in the last conversation we had, and there are many videos on this subject. This is a reoccurring pattern that I can show over and over again, where these are very, very specific shapes that are matching the anatomy of a heart to perfection. And if you know the anatomy, you could understand why. And there's a lot of specificities, and I could show hundreds of these, you know, and just go one after the other and show why they're lining up. So that's where, you know, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, this idea that things could petrify very quickly, you know, was a mind blow to me. Like, okay, now I'm going to look at my physical reality, because if we're not in a simulation, it might be the simulation in the mind of God anyway. But you know, if it's not some computer construct, then we do have a matrix overlay, which is all the lies that we're taught that cause us to not perceive reality correctly and not interact with nature in a proper way. So then we get all of the negative impacts of a life out of balance. Koyaanisqatsi, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the movies from the 80s, but Koyaanisqatsi and Poaquatsi, life out of balance, and I don't remember what the other one was. So we live in these very imbalanced ways, and you know, it's because we don't have a clue about the true nature of life. So if there is a true
Oh,
nature and there is a truth.
I don't want to cut you off. I have to take care of this real quick. Can you hold on just
Sure.
1 second?
Yeah. Just show some of the heart stones while we're waiting. So there's blood vessels at the top. They have this concave shape. It'll be like a knife edge on one side, which is the right ventricle, which is a thinner wall, and then the left ventricle will be thicker. And then when the heart contracts, it does this spiral contraction, and a lot of these stones have this kind of propeller twist at the bottom. Sometimes they'll be fleshy, or have these little indentations at the top, and it's a very, very, very specific shape that repeats itself over and over again. And if you just familiarize yourself with basic heartstone anatomy, you can go out and you can find these things over and over again. They come in all sizes. The shapes vary because hearts take on different shapes. Like an elephant heart is big and round and like a glob, and then a giraffe's heart will be narrow. See, there's the thicker side, and there's the knife edge, and there's that propeller twist at the bottom. Some of them will be very fleshy. They'll actually show the remains of the blood. This is at the top. I'm just doing a little. I was doing a little Hearthstone course for the listeners while you were gone. So just to finish up the thought is that I do believe that there is an objective, truth and physical reality, and so if we apply the scientific method honestly, recognizing its limitations, then it's not effective for things like consciousness and innate intelligence and all the animating force that creates our world. The scientific method is not great for that sort of thing, but it's good for observation and quantification. And if you use that and observe the realm that way, like I came across this pattern that is highly specific, and according to the mainstream model, it shouldn't be there, because we're told that these are stones that have just broken off of larger structures, and they bounced around in river bottoms, and they've been eroded by water and wind and whatnot. And just like what we were describing before with the giant trees, and that the whole sedimentary layer thing makes no sense when confronted with what you see geologically. But what does make sense is that that's actually biology, but on a scale you can't fathom and that we've been taught not to see. And the same thing goes with a lot of the stones that are smaller. They're not part of bigger structures. They may be standalone stones that could have once been organs, or been even stones that our body is producing, like gallstones and kidney stones and those kinds of things. Lymphatic, the lymph nodes, we have 600 lymph nodes in our body. If those petrified, that would be a lot of stones in just one body. So anyway, that's what I wanted to conclude with. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to say.
No, that's brilliant, Mike. I knew you were the man to talk to about the combining the electrical universe, or you and I are in the same thing. I don't believe, like, universe is just what we're experiencing, and the biogeology aspect of things relative to current happenings. I was just like, I wanted to catch up with you and have this conversation. Is there anything that you're going to be offering up soon or soonish that you'd like people to know about, and where can people find all of your work?
I've this year I've done a few different conferences where we met in Mexico at Anarchapulco. I was
Yes.
at Music and Sky, and I was also at Librepulco, speaking on an entirely different subject there. I was speaking on matters of health relating to chiropractic and the Rockefeller takeover of medicine that happened at the beginning of the 1900s. It was fun to kind of branch out and talk about other things, since it's my roots as a chiropractor. But as far as I don't have anything on scheduled as far as further speaking events. I'm going to be working over the next few months to once and for all get out a book that I wrote a long time ago that got waylaid by my YouTube channel and all these discoveries. That's on a completely different subject. It has to do with my past as a teen hacker. I got caught, busted for hacking in the 80s, and actually went to jail for that. So it's a hell of a story that definitely deserves to finally be published and come out. So I'm going to be working on that. I'm leaving next week for Portugal to go to there's a conference on water there, and Veda
Hmm.
Austin and Gerald Pollack will be speaking, and a lot of other speakers who are the cutting edge of learning the new knowledge about our understanding of water. So I'm just going for the fun of it. I'll be meeting up with some friends there, and then I've got some different stuff I'll be coming out with on the channel. Got a long list of stuff that I could do, but I've been busier than ever chiropractically, also because a nearby colleague closed their doors after 22 years, and a lot of their patients are working their way to me. So I've been professionally, I've been busier than ever, and still trying to find time to do all the other stuff I'd like to
Well, that's what happens when you're good, man. You're in demand. I love hearing that.
do. Yeah. Yeah. No,
Mike, this has
I'm
been
definitely appreciative.
well, hopefully I get to see you in record-breaking time. Like, hopefully it doesn't take a couple of years for that to happen.
Yeah.
Or
I'd love to
yeah,
come to your part of the world, and now I've got a whole half a dozen friends that all live right there. So
yeah. I think I'm going to be doing, what is it called? What's Alex Zek's event in
Confluence.
Texas?
Yeah,
Confluence.
I'd love to go to that. Hopefully, I'll get an invite.
That'd be cool.
Alec and I have had the chance to pal around now at 3 different events, and I love that guy. He's awesome. And oh, you guys you went and interviewed with him. That was fun.
Yeah.
I got a shout out there. I was very proud of that.
I shout you out as much as I can. I love your work. So
Oh, I know. Thanks. I appreciate it. I love your
awesome.
stuff too. You're awesome.
Brilliant, my man. Well, you have a good one. I think I'm going to probably, I have a bunch of interviews in the can, but I want this one to go out while people are like, have all this like misinformation in their mind about weather systems. So I'm probably going to get this out pretty soon.
Cool. Battle the fear porn. One last thing.
Yes.
Prospiracy is a term I coined. You know, when you
Nice.
dig into things, you dig into things enough to realize that the monster has no teeth. You know, I think of the nuclear hoax. I think of virology. I think of you know, asteroid strikes, all of these things. When you dig deep enough into this stuff and you realize that the evidence for it is flimsy, it leaves you feeling empowered and less afraid. So that, you know, there's plenty of stuff to be afraid of out there, but every once in a while a prospiracy comes along and it's like, you know, I mean, to the people who've dug into this stuff, every time NASA, you know, says, oh, there's an object that's, you know, X miles across is heading for the earth, you know, and it's going to get this close to us. It's like we just shake our heads and laugh because it's like there's no there's no way they're going to convince us of that kind of stuff. So anyway,
No,
prospiracy.
I love it. I love it. Well, Mr. Mike, I will get back to you as soon as possible and have a great rest of your Saturday evening. And I look
Thanks.
forward to talking to you soon.
Likewise. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.
You ought to know by now. You ought to know. Well, now you ought to know by now.
I hope you enjoyed the interview with Mike Wilkerson. Please check him out at Stellium7. That's his YouTube channel. And I'm sure he's on a bunch of the other players out there. He is a guy that's in the field, and as you know, I love that where you actually are getting your hands dirty. And plus the fact that he is very chiral like myself, I really appreciate that also because there's something that occurs when you work with your hands, no matter whether it's masonry, whether it's yard work, whether it's massage or chiropractic. There's something like we're human and we have a thumb and there's something about being a human and having opposable thumbs. The more you use your hands, I think it kind of endears you to creation, but that could just be my musings. What did we actually say in this podcast? So it was mainly, the discussion was around, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before, but we're technically standing on the shoulders of giants. Like we're technically standing on top of creatures that were once very, very large. And the size of these beings is to such an extent that as they decay after their petrification, pretty much what we're calling our biology or excuse me, what we're calling our geology was their biology. There's a plateau in Venezuela where when you zoom out, when you're far enough away, because it's massive, it's a tree stump. Like, you can't tell me any different. And all the water pumping out of this thing it's indicative of one time that when that was a tree, however deep those roots go from that old tree stump, it's pumping up water. I mean, I chop down trees all the time, much smaller scale, and you'll just see water oozing out of them. Could you imagine a tree that the diameter of the base of the trunk of the tree was a few miles wide? How much water that would be pulling up from the lower aquifers? I mean, that's the type of scale we're talking about. The scale of things that were well beyond what Avatar, that animation showed. Like, you're talking trees that were miles tall, beings that were miles long. I mean, that's amazing, right? Like the standard person, if they're in good shape, can run a mile in about 6.5 minutes. Imagine you're in good shape and you're running as hard as you can for like 20 minutes. You wouldn't even get across the back of one of these creatures. That's how big they are. That's the scale. The reason why I wanted to bring this up with bringing Mike on is I've been doing all these conversations where we're talking about weather patterns and plasma and electricity and this, that, and the other. It's very important to understand that the colloid that's above us, the atmosphere with all these particulates in it, can have desiccated genetic material of things that are ancient. People can do these samples of the rain, and if they think that they're in a model of land that was just, inert, and then they find biological material in it, they could get a very, very wrong. They could come to wrong conclusions because their assumptions of their model are incorrect, right? So that's why I wanted to bring this up. And then also talking just about the notion of these great plasma cycles that come through. Obviously, a plasma cycle that would come through now wouldn't be at the scale of what instantly petrified a Titan per se, because we're not at that scale. But there is enough energy in the system where we could have a plasma event that would cause instant petrification of things that are at our scale. If you want to like really have fun and like read of different let's just say theories of timelines and epics and everything like that, I would always would recommend the Upanishads, the ancient Hindu texts. And then if that floats your boat, read the Puranas, because they talk about things that are like very, very advanced, but we're told about things that they're like it's supposedly telling us about history, right? So that gave me a lot of insight into the scale of things at one time, even though I was reading it for a quote unquote spiritual purpose. I think there was some very practical information in there. I've been having a wonderful time doing live streams, being on other people's live streams, and just kicking it. As of late, if you haven't caught up with my two discussions with Big Bear Owen Benjamin, we did 2 podcasts at the end of his week on electricity, which was awesome, and did a couple of podcasts, Vibrance, with Chance Garton of the Interverse. Excellent. This upcoming week, I'm going on, I believe, on the week of the 22nd, October 22nd, I'm going to be on live with Jason Brashears of Archaics. Can't wait to talk chronology with him. The other night with Marty Leeds and Chance Garton, we talked about chronology a little bit. Also with Slick Dissident on YouTube, we talked a little bit about chronology and the number 72, which very oddly, very dovetailed in nicely with what I've been experimenting with this new calendar that I've been using that's based off the rule of 72. And by the way, ever since switching to that calendar, uh, I think I got into the most perfect natural rhythm that I've ever been in life. So I'll leave it at that. I'll let you experiment with that. Um, God, what's the name of the inventor of that? I'm forgetting right now. I'm a bad host. But if you look back through my corpus of podcasts, it's the new calendar. It's Thomas something Sheridan, Thomas Sherman, I believe. That calendar is pretty cool. We just entered what's known as early fall, and it's incredible because it's 85 degrees outside here in the Ozarks. So we are loving this nice late warm blast before the cold weather comes. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your guys' support. You can send analog super chats to my PO box in Willow Springs, Missouri. If you feel like donating at coraldomes@gmail.com is my PayPal. I also have a donate tab on my website, topherhq.com. We're building a bunch of domes now. We have 1, 2, 4, 5. We have 6 dome projects underway, which is pretty awesome. And so, if you guys are interested in any domes or any type of curvilinear structures, or if you need somebody to actually help consult you through the master planning, and especially if you're into permaculture and you live in an area where you can build what you want without somebody else's permission, I have consulting services that you can access from my website. And I'm also doing the Celestic profiles for people, which seems to be like really popular. I had no idea that that would be like my most popular thing out there. But people really tend to love essentially, I'm reading your astral body, and I'm reading it from 2 vantage points. So think of the difference between a monopolar hologram and a dipolar hologram. The system I use sees you as a dipolar hologram, which is closer to the truth. So that particular system people are seeming to really appreciate. So if you want to book a session with me on that, just send me an email at info@topherhq.com. And I'm going to start as soon as I get all my product here for my new setup, my new podcasting setup. I'm going to be populating Substack a bunch with my musings, which I'm really excited about because I'll get to diagram things for you. And so that's a lot of fun. So thank you once again for your attention. I appreciate it. I would like to announce the role of the comedy Must Be Nice by Owen Benjamin. I got to see it in person. I thought it was wonderful. And for those of you that have been listening to me for a long time, you know I love male-female dynamics, and this comedy is some of the best to get into that. And it's one of the only comedy specials I've ever seen where the mother is addressed in a very specific way, which is awesome. It is a very, very intelligent, funny comedy. So please support Owen Benjamin by purchasing that special if you can at owenbenjamin.com. And thank you again for joining me. And oh, yeah, and I'll put on the Telegram chat. I always forget to talk about the Telegram chat. We have about 950 people on there that are constantly discussing lots of really cool stuff, ladling lots of gravy I love the community that's kind of forming around this. Check that out and join. Share this podcast with at least one other person. I like that model. Like if you get benefit from what I share it. You get what you give. So go ahead and reciprocate in that way. That'd be awesome. And also I have t-shirts. Is my business manager, he will soon be updating the website, but I have really cool t-shirts with the new BioCharisma logo on it. I have them black, and then I'm also going to be starting a more, I guess you would say, normie, experimentally based channel on YouTube. And I have those shirts also available. I actually probably shouldn't announce that one just yet. But yeah, that's coming up along with the Substack. So I'll have more and more good stuff for you guys. I'll have diagrams of my retorts and instructional videos, and I've been promising that forever. And yeah, I've had some technical difficulties with producing that, but that's coming soon. So thank you guys, and I will see you next week.